I held the letter in my trembling hands, the paper still warm from where it had been pressed against his chest. The ink was smudged with something I didn't want to identify. Blood, maybe. Or tears. The soldier's last words were written in handwriting so shaky it looked like a child's attempt at cursive. He had gripped my wrist with what little strength remained in his broken body and whispered through cracked lips that this letter was more important than his life. I promised him I would deliver it. I had no idea that promise would destroy everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the weight of secrets we carry to our graves. My name is Margaret Cole, and I've been a nurse at Camp Blanding in Florida for 3 years. I've seen things that would make most people lose sleep for months. Young men arriving with wounds that defy description. Soldiers calling out for their mothers in languages I don't understand. The smell of antiseptic, mixed with fear and desperation that clings to the walls of our medical tents. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on that suffocating August evening when they brought in Private Daniel Ashford. He wasn't supposed to survive the transport. The medics told me that much before they even wheeled him through the tent flaps. Shrapnel had torn through his abdomen, and internal bleeding was shutting down his organs one by one. His face was gray, the color of old newspaper, and his breathing came in wet, rattling gasps that I knew meant his lungs were filling with fluid. I've learned to recognize the signs of a dying man, and Daniel Ashford had maybe an hour left if we were lucky. But he wasn't concerned about his wounds. He wasn't asking for morphine or calling for a chaplain. His eyes, still sharp despite the pain that must have been overwhelming, locked onto mine the moment I approached his cot. His hand shot out with surprising force and grabbed my uniform. "Pull me closer," he rasped. His breath was hot and metallic against my ear. "I need you to swear something to me. Swear on everything you hold sacred." I should have called for the doctor. I should have focused on making him comfortable in his final moments. But something in his voice, something raw and desperate, made me lean in. "I swear," I whispered back, not even knowing what I was promising. He released my uniform and fumbled inside his jacket, his movements clumsy and weak. When his hand emerged, it was clutching a sealed envelope, the paper stained and bent, but still intact. "This letter goes to Catherine Ashford in Tallahassee," he said, each word costing him effort. "My wife. She needs to know before anyone else tells her, before the army sends their notification, before his family twists everything." The way he said his family made my skin prickle. There was venom in that word, a bitterness that seemed out of place in a dying man's final requests. I took the letter, feeling its weight in my palm. It seemed too light to carry whatever burden he was placing on me. "I'll make sure she gets it," I promised. He nodded, and something like relief softened the hard lines of pain around his mouth. "Tell her I kept my word," he added. "Tell her I never stopped fighting for what we had, even when they tried to bury it." I wanted to ask what he meant. Who tried to bury what? But his eyes were already losing focus, his grip on consciousness slipping away like water through fingers. The doctor arrived and began the futile work of trying to stabilize the unstabilizable. I stepped back, tucking the letter into my pocket, feeling it press against my hip like a burning coal. Daniel Ashford died 17 minutes later. He never regained consciousness. He never said another word. But that letter in my pocket felt heavier with each passing minute, as if his death had transferred some essential weight into those sealed pages. I didn't open it. That wasn't my place. But I knew I had to deliver it, had to honor the promise I'd made to a dying soldier whose desperation had reached across the barrier between life and death to grab hold of me. The next morning, I requested 3 days of leave. My supervisor was surprised since I rarely took time off, but she approved it without much question. I told her I needed to visit family in Tallahassee. That wasn't entirely a lie. I was visiting someone's family, even if they weren't mine. I packed a small bag, tucked the letter carefully into an inner pocket where it wouldn't get crushed, and caught the first bus heading north. The whole journey, I kept touching that pocket, making sure the letter was still there. I rehearsed what I would say when I found Catherine Ashford. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your husband asked me to deliver this personally. He wanted you to have it before the official notification arrived. But none of those words felt adequate. How do you hand someone the last thoughts of their dying spouse and make it feel like anything other than a nightmare? But if you think this was the end, you're wrong." Tallahassee in August felt like breathing through wet cotton. The heat wrapped around everything, thick and oppressive, making even simple movements feel like wading through invisible syrup. I stepped off the bus with my small bag and the letter that had become an obsession over the past 30 hours. I had barely slept during the journey, my mind spinning through possibilities of what those pages might contain and what kind of woman Catherine Ashford would turn out to be. Finding her address wasn't difficult. The military records I'd quietly accessed before leaving camp had listed her information. She lived on a quiet street lined with oak trees, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed in the sluggish breeze. The house was modest, but well-maintained, painted a pale yellow with white shutters that gleamed in the harsh sunlight. Flowers bloomed in neat beds along the front walk, their colors almost too bright against the backdrop of summer brown grass. Everything about the house screamed normalcy, domesticity, the kind of life that seemed impossible to reconcile with the dying soldier's desperate urgency. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, my hand in my pocket touching the letter. A part of me wanted to simply mail it and return to camp, to avoid whatever scene was about to unfold. But I had promised. "Tell her," he had said. "Tell her I kept my word." That meant facing her, seeing her reaction, being present for whatever grief or relief or confusion the letter would bring. I walked up the path and knocked on the door. The sound seemed too loud, too final. For a moment, nothing happened, and I felt a strange mixture of disappointment and relief. Maybe she wasn't home. Maybe I could leave the letter with a neighbor and fulfill my obligation without having to witness the fallout. Then the door opened, and I found myself looking at Catherine Ashford. She was younger than I expected, maybe 25 at most, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, and eyes that were an unsettling shade of green. She wore a light cotton dress and an apron dusted with flour, and there was something in her expression that made me pause. Not grief. Not the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a woman waiting for bad news about her husband at war. Instead, she looked almost annoyed at the interruption, as if I were a door-to-door salesman disrupting her afternoon baking. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. "I'm Margaret Cole," I said, suddenly unsure how to continue. "I'm a nurse at Camp Blanding. I need to speak with you about your husband, Daniel Ashford." Something flickered across her face then, too quick for me to identify. She glanced past me at the empty street, then stepped back and gestured for me to come inside. The house was cool and dim after the blazing heat outside. She led me to a sitting room that smelled of lavender and old books. We sat across from each other, and I noticed her hands were trembling slightly as she smoothed her apron. "You said you need to speak about Daniel," she said carefully. "Is he injured? Has something happened?" "I'm very sorry," I began, using the words I'd rehearsed. "Your husband passed away 2 days ago from injuries sustained in training. But before he died, he asked me to deliver something to you personally." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the letter, holding it between us like an offering. Catherine stared at the envelope but didn't reach for it. Her face had gone very pale, and I saw her throat work as she swallowed. "He gave you that?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "He was very insistent that you receive it before anyone else contacted you. He said you needed to know before his family twisted everything." At the mention of his family, something changed in Catherine's expression. Her eyes hardened, and when she finally took the letter from my hand, her movements were sharp, almost angry. "Of course he did," she murmured, more to herself than to me. Even dying, he couldn't let it go. I didn't understand her reaction. Where was the grief? Where was the collapse into tears that I'd been bracing myself to witness? Instead, she sat there holding her dead husband's final letter with the kind of tense control that suggested she was holding back something much more complicated than simple sorrow. "Mrs. Ashford," I said gently, "are you all right? Do you need me to call someone? A family member or friend who could be with you right now?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in those green eyes that made my stomach drop. It was fear. Not the fear of loss, but the fear of secrets about to be exposed. "Tell me something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did Daniel say anything else to you? Anything about why this letter was so important?" I thought back to those final moments. I told her about his insistence, about the way he'd grabbed my uniform, about his words regarding keeping his word and fighting for what they had. I watched her face as I spoke, and with each detail, she seemed to fold further into herself. "You have no idea what you've walked into," she said finally. "This letter, whatever Daniel wrote in his final moments, it's not a love letter. It's not a goodbye. It's a weapon. And by bringing it here, you've just armed me with something that will destroy more than just one family." I felt cold despite the heat. "What do you mean?" I asked. Catherine stood abruptly, still clutching the unopened letter. She walked to the window and stared out at the quiet street. For a long moment she didn't speak, and I could see her shoulders rising and falling with careful, controlled breaths. When she turned back to me, her expression had changed again. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Determination, maybe. Or resignation. "Miss Cole," she said, "you seem like a kind person. Someone who keeps promises and believes in doing the right thing. So, I'm going to tell you something. And then you're going to decide whether you want to stay and see this through, or walk away and forget you ever came here." She sat back down, perching on the edge of her chair like a bird ready to take flight. "Daniel and I have been married for 3 years, she began. But our marriage wasn't what anyone thought it was. His family, the Ashfords, they're one of the wealthiest families in Florida. Old money, connections that reach into every corner of state politics and business. When Daniel married me, a girl from nothing with no family name and no fortune, they cut him off completely." Catherine's hands were shaking harder now as she continued. "They didn't just cut him off financially," she said. "They tried to erase me from existence. His mother, Charlotte Ashford, she's the real power in that family. She hired investigators to dig up dirt on me, tried to bribe me to leave, even threatened to have me arrested on fabricated charges. When none of that worked, she did something worse." She paused, her fingers tightening around the letter until the paper crumpled slightly at the edges. "What did she do?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Catherine's eyes met mine, and in them I saw a depth of pain that finally matched what I'd expected to find when I knocked on her door. "She convinced Daniel that I had been unfaithful," Catherine said, her voice breaking for the first time. "She manufactured evidence. Photos that were doctored to show me with another man. Letters that I never wrote. Witnesses who were paid to lie about seeing me in places I'd never been. And Daniel, he was so torn between his love for me and his loyalty to his family that he started to believe it, started to question everything we had built together. I felt something twist in my chest. The dying soldier's words echoed in my mind. Tell her I kept my word. Tell her I never stopped fighting for what we had, even when they tried to bury it. Suddenly, those words took on new meaning, a darker and more desperate significance. "We were falling apart," Catherine continued. "The last 6 months before he enlisted were hell. We would fight, then reconcile, then fight again. He would look at me with suspicion in his eyes, and I could see his mother's poison working through his mind like a disease. I begged him to trust me. I showed him bank records, alibi after alibi, anything to prove the accusations were lies. But doubt is a terrible thing, Miss Cole. Once it takes root, It grows like weeds choking out everything good. Why did he enlist? I asked. Was he running away? Catherine laughed, but it was a bitter sound with no humor in it. He enlisted because his mother gave him an ultimatum. She said if he went to war and served honorably, if he proved himself to be a true Ashford, she would tell him the truth. She would reveal whether the evidence against me was real or fabricated. She turned his military service into a test, a trial he had to pass to earn the right to know if his wife had betrayed him. The cruelty of it took my breath away. What kind of mother would do that to her own son? What kind of woman would use a war as a bargaining chip in a family power struggle? I thought of Daniel Ashford lying on that cot, his life bleeding out of him, desperate to get this letter to his wife before his family could control the narrative. Now I understood why. Did she keep her promise? I asked. Did she tell him the truth before he died? Catherine's face crumpled, and for the first time since I'd arrived, tears began to stream down her cheeks. I don't know, she whispered. He stopped writing to me 2 months ago. Before that, his letters were full of confusion and pain. He would say he loved me in one paragraph and accuse me of destroying him in the next. Then nothing. Just silence. I thought maybe he had decided to believe his mother's lies. I thought I had lost him even before he died. She finally looked down at the letter in her hands, this crumpled envelope that had traveled from a dying man's chest to this quiet house in Tallahassee. This is the first communication I've had from him in 8 weeks, she said softly, and I'm terrified to open it. What if his last words to me are accusations? What if he died believing I betrayed him? How am I supposed to live with that? I moved to sit beside her, no longer just a messenger, but a witness to a tragedy that extended far beyond a soldier's death. Maybe that's not what the letter says, I offered, trying to provide some comfort. He told me to tell you he kept his word, that he never stopped fighting for what you had. That doesn't sound like a man who believed the lies. Catherine wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. Or maybe he discovered the truth too late, she said. Maybe he learned his mother had manipulated him, and this letter is his apology written in his final moments. Either way, opening this envelope changes everything. If he knew the truth, if he has proof that his mother fabricated evidence against me, then I have ammunition to destroy the Ashford family reputation. Charlotte Ashford has built an empire on the image of respectability and honor. If it comes out that she psychologically tortured her own son and tried to ruin an innocent woman's life, it would be a scandal that would reach every newspaper in the state. Is that what you want? I asked carefully. Revenge? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the sealed envelope as if it might reveal its contents through sheer force of will. I don't know what I want anymore, she admitted. Part of me wants to burn their world down, to make Charlotte Ashford feel even a fraction of the pain she caused Daniel and me. But another part of me just wants to grieve my husband in peace, to remember the man I fell in love with before his family poisoned everything between us. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. We sat in that suspended moment, 2 women connected by a dead soldier's final wish, both afraid of what would happen when the seal on that letter was finally broken. Outside, I could hear children playing in a neighboring yard, their laughter a stark contrast to the heavy silence in Catherine's sitting room. Maybe I should read it first, Catherine said suddenly, before I decide what to do with the information, before I choose between justice and peace. She looked at me with an expression that was almost pleading. Will you stay, Miss Cole? Will you stay while I read it? I don't think I can face whatever is in here alone. I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. Catherine took a deep breath, slid her finger under the envelope's seal, and began to tear it open. The sound of ripping paper seemed unnaturally loud, like the tearing of something that could never be repaired. She pulled out several pages covered in that same shaky handwriting I had glimpsed when Daniel first gave me the letter. And then Catherine Ashford began to read her dead husband's final words, and everything we thought we understood about this tragedy shifted like sand beneath our feet. Catherine's voice was barely steady as she began reading aloud, and I watched her face transform with each word. "My dearest Catherine," the letter started. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. And I pray that the nurse I entrusted with this letter kept her word. I am writing to you from a place of clarity I should have found months ago, but fear and family loyalty kept me blind. I need you to know that I discovered the truth, all of it, and I am so desperately sorry for ever doubting you." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. She looked at me with wide eyes before continuing, her voice trembling. "3 weeks ago, I received a package from someone I never expected. Your sister, Margaret. Yes, the same sister my mother claimed died years ago in that car accident. She's alive, Catherine. She's been alive this whole time, and my mother paid her to disappear, to stay silent, to let you believe you were utterly alone in this world, so that you would be easier to break." I felt my own breath catch. The layers of deception were deeper than either of us had imagined. Catherine's hands shook so badly the pages rustled like leaves in wind. "Margaret found me," the letter continued. "She tracked me down at camp and told me everything. How my mother had approached her 2 years before we married, offered her $50,000 to leave Florida and never contact you again. How she was told that staying in your life would only bring you poverty and shame. Margaret was young, desperate, and believed that taking the money was actually helping you. She thought you'd be better off believing she was dead than knowing she'd abandoned you for cash." Catherine was openly crying now, tears streaming down her face and falling onto the pages. But Margaret couldn't live with the guilt. Daniel's letter continued. "She tracked down the investigators my mother hired, the ones who manufactured evidence of your infidelity. She paid them more than my mother did, and they confessed everything. They gave her copies of the original photos before they were altered, documentation of payments from my mother, signed statements admitting their role in fabricating evidence. Margaret put it all together and brought it to me because she couldn't stand what her choices had helped my mother do to you, to us." The letter detailed more, page after page of revelations that painted Charlotte Ashford not as a protective mother, but as a calculating manipulator who had orchestrated the destruction of her son's marriage with surgical precision. Daniel wrote about confronting his mother through letters, about her cold response that everything she'd done was for his own good, that Catherine was beneath the Ashford name, and he would thank her someday for saving him from a terrible mistake. But the most devastating part came near the end of the letter. Catherine read through tears that made her voice thick and broken. "I realized something in these final weeks, my love. My mother didn't just want to separate us. She wanted to break you so completely that even if I eventually learned the truth, you'd be too destroyed to take me back. She wanted to ensure that her version of my future, one with a woman from the right family with the right connections, would be the only possible path. She was willing to sacrifice my happiness, my sanity, and ultimately my life to maintain her control." Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper as she read the next paragraph. "Because I believe my mother knows I discovered her lies. And I believe that's why my training accident happened. I can't prove it, but the equipment failure that nearly killed 3 of us, the faulty parachute rigging, the way our commanding officer seemed nervous when I started asking questions about maintenance records. My mother has connections that reach far. If she knew I planned to return home and expose her, if she knew I had evidence that could destroy the Ashford reputation, she would do anything to silence me." The room felt airless. I stared at Catherine, and she stared back at me, both of us processing the implication. "Are you saying—" I began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Catherine did it for me. "He's saying his mother may have arranged his death," she whispered. "That the accident that killed him might not have been an accident at all." The pages trembled in her hands as she found her place again. I don't have time to investigate further, Daniel had written. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and I died in a tragic malfunction. But if I'm right, Catherine, you need to be careful. The evidence Margaret gave me is hidden in our house, behind the loose floorboard in our bedroom closet, the one we discovered on our first night in that house. Do you remember? We laughed about it, said it was perfect for hiding love letters. I never imagined I'd use it to hide evidence of my mother's crimes. Catherine stood abruptly, the letter falling from her hands onto the floor. She moved like someone in a trance, walking out of the sitting room and down a hallway. I followed, picking up the scattered pages, my heart pounding. We entered a modest bedroom that still showed signs of being shared. Men's clothes hung in the closet beside women's dresses. A pair of shoes sat by the bed that were clearly too large to be Catherine's. She dropped to her knees in the closet and began pulling at the floorboards with her fingers. One came loose, and she reached into the dark space beneath. When her hand emerged, it was holding a thick manila envelope. She sat back on her heels, staring at it like it might explode. "This is it," she said quietly. "Whatever evidence Margaret gave him. Whatever proof exists that Charlotte Ashford destroyed our marriage and possibly murdered her own son." She looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw a war being fought. Fear against fury. Grief against the burning need for justice. I should have realized then that we weren't alone in understanding the stakes. I should have paid attention to the car that had been parked across the street since I arrived, the one with tinted windows that I'd dismissed as belonging to a neighbor. I should have noticed how quiet the house had become, how even the sounds from outside seemed muted and wrong. But I didn't notice any of those things until Catherine started opening the manila envelope, and we heard the unmistakable sound of the front door being forced open. Heavy footsteps moved through the house with purpose, multiple sets of feet heading in our direction. Catherine's eyes went wide with terror, and she clutched the envelope to her chest. "They're here," she breathed. "Charlotte sent them. She knows about the letter." Before I could ask how that was possible, two men appeared in the bedroom doorway. They were large, professional, wearing suits that seemed absurdly formal for breaking into someone's home. One of them smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice pleasant and terrifying in its calmness. "We're going to need you to hand over that envelope, and then you and your friend are going to come with us. There are some people who'd like to have a conversation with you about your late husband's unfortunate passing and the wild accusations he made before his death." Catherine clutched the envelope tighter, backing against the closet wall. "Over my dead body," she said, her voice stronger than I expected. The man who had spoken tilted his head slightly, as if considering her offer. "That can be arranged, Mrs. Ashford," he replied. "But it would be unnecessarily messy. Mrs. Charlotte Ashford simply wants to have a civilized conversation about some misunderstandings regarding her late son." I stepped between Catherine and the men, my nurse's instinct to protect overriding my terror. "You can't just break into someone's home and threaten them," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is illegal. Someone will notice. The neighbors will call the police." The second man laughed, a sound like gravel scraping against metal. "The neighbors have been paid to take their children inside and close their curtains," he said. "And as for the police, well, the Ashford family has certain arrangements with local law enforcement. No one is coming to help you." But he was wrong, because at that exact moment we heard another voice from the front of the house, clear and commanding. "Federal agents, everyone stay exactly where you are." The two men in the doorway went rigid, their hands moving toward their jackets before freezing. Three people in FBI windbreakers appeared behind them, weapons drawn, faces set in expressions of absolute authority. "Step away from the women," one of the agents ordered. The two men complied slowly, their professional confidence evaporating. As they were handcuffed and led away, a woman in her 50s entered the bedroom. She had Catherine's eyes, the same shade of unsettling green, and the same dark hair now streaked with gray. Catherine made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Margaret, she whispered. The woman, Margaret, smiled with tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry I took so long, little sister, she said. But I had to make sure we did this right, that we had enough evidence to protect you and bring Charlotte Ashford down permanently. Over the next hour, sitting in Catherine's living room with FBI agents positioned throughout the house, Margaret explained everything. After giving Daniel the evidence of their mother-in-law's crimes, she hadn't just walked away. She'd gone to the FBI with her own confession about taking bribe money and detailed knowledge of Charlotte Ashford's network of corruption. The Ashford family's influence extended far beyond social manipulation. They were involved in military contract fraud, bribery of government officials, and witness intimidation that had been going on for decades. The FBI had been building a case for months, Margaret explained, but they needed something concrete, something that would crack open the entire operation. When I told them about Daniel's suspicions regarding his training accident, they started investigating. The agent leading the case, a stern-faced man named Morrison, leaned forward. We found evidence of tampering with equipment maintenance records at Camp Blanding, he said. Someone with significant connections altered inspection logs and paid off a supply sergeant to ensure faulty equipment would be assigned to specific trainees. Your husband wasn't paranoid, Mrs. Ashford. Someone did try to kill him. Catherine's face had gone completely white. The envelope slipped from her hands, landing on the coffee table between us. And my mother-in-law, she asked quietly. Charlotte Ashford. Was she behind it? Agent Morrison exchanged glances with his colleagues before answering. We have communications between Mrs. Charlotte Ashford and a private military contractor with ties to organized crime. The messages are coded, but our analysts believe they constitute conspiracy to commit murder. Combined with the evidence your husband collected about the manufactured adultery accusations, we have enough to arrest her on multiple federal charges. The room felt like it was spinning. I had come to Tallahassee to deliver a letter from a dying soldier to his wife. I had stumbled into a conspiracy that reached from wealthy Florida socialite circles into military corruption and contract murder. None of this seemed real, yet here we were, surrounded by federal agents discussing the arrest of one of the state's most powerful women. But Margaret looked troubled, her joy at reuniting with her sister tempered by something else. There's more, she said quietly. Something I need to tell you before you hear it from someone else. Catherine, when I went to the FBI, I had to tell them everything, including things about our family, about our father. Catherine stiffened. What about Dad? She asked. Margaret took a deep breath. He didn't die in a fishing accident like we were told. Charlotte Ashford had him killed. This was before you even met Daniel, back when you two had just started dating. Our father did some legal work for the Ashford family business, discovered irregularities in their accounts, threatened to report them. Charlotte made it look like an accident, paid off the investigators, and we never knew the truth. The revelation hit Catherine like a physical blow. She doubled over, hands pressed against her stomach, making small wounded sounds that broke my heart. Everything, she gasped. Everything in my life that went wrong. Everyone I lost. It all traces back to that woman. My father, my sister disappearing, my marriage falling apart, my husband dead. All of it was Charlotte Ashford pulling strings and destroying anyone who threatened her perfect world. Agent Morrison's expression softened slightly. Mrs. Ashford, we understand this is overwhelming, but you need to know that your husband's letter, combined with the evidence he collected and your sister's testimony, is going to bring Charlotte Ashford's entire empire crashing down. She's being arrested as we speak at her estate. Her assets are being frozen. Every person she bribed, every official she corrupted, every crime she committed is being exposed. Catherine looked up, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes suddenly burning with an intensity that made her look dangerous. I want to see her, she said. I want to look Charlotte Ashford in the face and let her know that she failed. That despite everything she did, despite everyone she hurt and every life she destroyed, the truth still came out. Daniel made sure of it, even from his grave. Margaret reached for her sister's hand. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "Seeing her might make this worse?" Catherine shook her head. "Nothing could make this worse," she said. But seeing her face when she realizes that her own son outsmarted her, that the woman she tried so hard to break is the one standing while she falls, that might make it slightly better. Agent Morrison nodded. "We can arrange that," he said. "But there's something you should prepare yourself for. Charlotte Ashford isn't someone who accepts defeat gracefully. Even in custody, she's been making threats, trying to use her remaining connections. She's claiming that Daniel was mentally unstable, that his accusations were the delusions of a disturbed mind, that his death was a tragic accident and nothing more. Then she doesn't know about the recording," Margaret said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device, an old-fashioned tape recorder. "When I gave Daniel the evidence," she explained, "I also gave him this." He recorded a conversation with his mother 3 days before his death. A conversation where she admitted to fabricating evidence against Catherine, where she laughed about how easy it was to manipulate him, where she said that if he didn't stop his investigation and fall in line, she would make sure he never made it home from the war. The silence in the room was absolute. Catherine stared at the recorder as if it were a holy relic. "Play it," she whispered. "I need to hear her voice. I need to know for certain." Margaret looked at Agent Morrison, who nodded his permission. She pressed play, and Charlotte Ashford's voice filled the room, cultured and cold and absolutely certain of her own untouchability. And what we all heard in that recording shattered every remaining illusion about the kind of monster that had been hiding behind a respectable family name. Charlotte Ashford's voice crackled through the recorder with a casual cruelty that made my skin crawl. "Daniel, darling, you have to understand that I did this for you," the recording began. "That woman was never going to fit into our world. She was common, unremarkable, and frankly an embarrassment to the Ashford name. The photographs, the witnesses, the hotel receipts. Yes, I arranged all of it, and it worked beautifully. I watched you pull away from her inch by inch, watched the doubt eat at you. It was almost too easy." There was a pause, then Daniel's voice, thick with betrayal and rage. "You destroyed my marriage. You made me believe the woman I love was unfaithful. How could you do that to your own son?" Charlotte laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. I saved you from making a permanent mistake. And now that you know the truth, you can divorce her properly, marry someone suitable, and we can all move forward. The Ashford legacy will continue through appropriate channels." Daniel's voice came again, trembling with barely controlled fury. "I'm going to expose you. Everything you've done. The bribery, the fraud, the manufactured evidence. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with threat. Then Charlotte spoke again, and her voice had lost all pretense of maternal warmth. "If you do that, darling boy, you won't survive the consequences. Accidents happen all the time, especially in military training. Equipment fails, parachutes don't open. Young soldiers die tragically before they ever make it home. It would be such a shame if something happened to you before you could spread these vicious lies about your own mother." Catherine's face was a mask of anguish as the recording continued. There was more. Minutes of Charlotte alternating between threats and attempts at manipulation, trying to convince Daniel that destroying her would destroy the entire family legacy, that his father's memory would be tarnished, that he would be responsible for ruining dozens of innocent people's lives. But Daniel held firm. "You're not going to control me anymore," he said on the recording. "I'm going to make sure Catherine knows the truth. I'm going to make sure everyone knows who you really are. And there's nothing you can do to stop me. The recording ended with the sound of a door slamming. Margaret turned off the device and looked at her sister. "He kept his word," she said softly. "Even knowing what his mother was capable of, he kept fighting for you." Catherine nodded, unable to speak, tears flowing freely down her face. Agent Morrison stood, his expression grim. "This recording, combined with everything else, is more than enough." Charlotte Ashford will spend the rest of her life in federal prison. The other people involved in the conspiracy are being rounded up as we speak. Your husband's death will be investigated as a homicide, and everyone responsible will be held accountable. 3 months later, I stood beside Catherine in a federal courthouse as Charlotte Ashford was sentenced. The woman who had once commanded such power and respect sat diminished in an orange jumpsuit, her carefully maintained appearance crumbling under the weight of her crimes. The judge's voice was steady and unforgiving as he detailed her offenses: conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, bribery of federal officials, fraud, witness tampering. The list seemed endless. When the judge announced a sentence of 35 years without possibility of parole, Charlotte's face remained blank. But I saw her hands clench in her lap. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims of her various schemes, and people whose lives she had touched with her corruption. As she was led away, she passed directly by Catherine and me. For just a moment, her eyes met Catherine's. "You won nothing," Charlotte said, her voice low but venomous. "My son is still dead. Your father is still dead. All this righteous justice doesn't bring them back. You're still alone." Catherine stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "I'm not alone," she said. "I have my sister back. I have the truth. And I have the knowledge that Daniel loved me enough to fight you even when it cost him everything. That's more than you'll ever understand about love or loyalty or family. You lost, Charlotte. Accept it." Charlotte Ashford was led away without another word, and I watched Catherine's shoulders finally relax as if a weight she'd been carrying for years had lifted. Outside the courthouse, Margaret wrapped her arms around her sister, and they stood together in the autumn sunlight, reunited after so many years of manufactured separation. I remained in touch with Catherine over the following months. She sold the house in Tallahassee, unable to live with the memories, and moved to North Carolina where Margaret had settled. The Ashford estate was seized by the federal government, its assets distributed to pay restitution to the many victims of Charlotte's schemes. Daniel was reburied with full military honors, his death officially recognized as murder, his name cleared of any suspicion that he had been mentally unstable or paranoid. Catherine established a foundation in Daniel's name to help families navigate military bureaucracy and investigate suspicious training deaths. She turned her grief into purpose, her pain into protection for others who might face similar circumstances. Margaret worked alongside her, the two sisters finally able to rebuild what Charlotte Ashford had tried so hard to destroy. As for me, I returned to Camp Blanding and continued my work as a nurse. But I never forgot those days in Tallahassee, never forgot the weight of that letter in my pocket or the promise I made to a dying soldier. I learned that sometimes keeping a promise costs nothing, and sometimes it unravels an entire world of secrets and lies. I learned that the truth has a weight to it, a momentum that can't be stopped once it's set in motion. Every time I see a soldier pass through our medical tents now, I wonder about their stories, about what letters they might carry, about what promises they've made, and what secrets they're keeping. I think about Daniel Ashford and how he used his final moments not for goodbye, but for justice. How he turned his death into a weapon against the person who caused it. How love, even when tested by doubt and manipulation, found a way to survive in his final act. Catherine sent me a letter last month. "She's getting better," she wrote. "The nightmares are less frequent. Margaret is teaching her to paint, and they spend their evenings creating art from the wreckage of their past. She thanked me again for keeping my promise, for being brave enough to deliver a letter that changed everything. She said that Daniel would have been grateful, that somehow, From wherever he is now, he knows that his final wish was honored. I keep that letter in the same pocket where I once carried Daniel's. A reminder that our actions matter, that promises have power, that truth, no matter how buried or how dangerous, will always find a way to surface. And I think about Charlotte Ashford, sitting in a prison cell, finally powerless, finally contained, destroyed by the very son she tried to control and the daughter-in-law she tried to break. Some stories don't have happy endings, but they have true endings, and sometimes that's enough. What's your most powerful story of a promise kept or a truth revealed that changed everything? Share it in the comments below.